And so, I mean, when we talk about Christian ethics, we're saying that there are certain foundational truths in Scripture that sometimes are a little sticky to navigate, but nonetheless, there are foundational truths that can be, that we rely on to then help steer us in a direction of what's good, what's right, what's better.
So what would one or two of those, or a few of those, these foundational truths be that could translate into our ethical probity and our ethical conduct?
Well, typically when I talk about this, I would say there are a set of commands that certainly provide us some ground rules, and I believe those things are set in the Scriptures for our good, not just for our constraint, but oftentimes having constraint is good. But we definitely can look at those different commands that are in Scripture, whether it be the Ten Commandments, but also those commands that Christ summarized, loving God and loving neighbor. Those commands are for our good, and they certainly lead to productive and positive relationships when we practice those. So there's kind of a set of commands. But as you know, if you've read a bit in there, not every one of your situations is clearly addressed by command in Scripture. So the other thing would be to look at, and this again, you could kind of pull these different philosophical perspectives and lump them in. There's a set of things, philosophies and ethics that kind of have to do with rights and basic universal truths, and those kind of fit with God's commands. There's another set of things, theories and philosophies that are on consequences, utilitarianism, kind of what's good for the greater masses and things like that.
Yeah, the common good, the greater good, that kind of language.
And so those, I think in a scriptural sense, you can look at places where the Scriptures and Jesus Christ in particular is asking us to look at stakeholders, if we want to use that language, that are less powerful than others, and to look at consequences in a different way, maybe even looking at them in terms of consequences for the marginal and the powerless. So I think consequences from a Christian perspective, we have some insight from the faith to help us weigh consequences. But I think the bigger question, so if I'm talking with a student, I say, from a Christian perspective, are there any commands that address this situation you're in? Are there any consequences you believe you should consider because of the faith and what we know about following Jesus Christ? And then the big question is, and sometimes this is shown up on wristbands and on slogans, but it really is, what would Jesus do in this situation, which is more of a character-based, virtue ethics. Like in this complex situation, what represents Christian character? What represents the good life that contributes to other people's flourishing as well as your own? And so I kind of look at them as I summarize all these different philosophies and theories into those three questions. Are there a set of commands? Are there some consequences I need to be aware of? And then what's the best route or alternative in light of Christian character, and particularly looking at the life of Christ? Boy, that's a long answer. That's a professor's answer.
But it's a good professor's answer. No, I appreciate that, because, and I think that you're right. The Christian teachings on consequences, and if you take utilitarianism and sort of the philosophical lingo and transpose it into looking at it through a biblical perspective, Jesus he's always upending common logic, and he's. Remember at the end when he says to his disciples, "What you fed me when I was hungry, naked, and poor." And we didn't do that. But so, as you've done this to the least of these, you've done it to me. So there's always this reminder to think of the ostracized person, the widow, the orphan, the alien.
Thanks. But I just heard from a recent graduate last week. He called me, and I won't mention the company, but it's a well-known company. And he said, my first job I was doing great within this company, and was recognized for exceeding my sales goals, and so somebody kind of plucked me out of one area and said, "Hey, we'd love to have you in our unit." And once he got dropped in that unit, he realized that this unit was operating on a different kind of moral basis, maybe a lacking moral basis. And so to get ahead there, the norm was to do some things that he was very uncomfortable with, because he felt like they're clearly wrong, and maybe a couple
exaggerating or misrepresenting products, or even more.
Yes, that, and playing kind of funny with the books, and when you register different sales and so on, and how you registered them, and so he said, here I don't think I can get ahead. I don't think I can even succeed very long, because everyone's doing it. And when I approached my boss and said, hey, here's what I'm hearing is the way things are done here, and I'm really uncomfortable with that. And they said, no, that's the way it's going to be. In fact, then later that next week, he had the supervisor come in and change a sale and move it into another quarter. And so, he's not calling me for career advice. He thankfully.
So what do you say to him? I mean, these are real questions, aren't they? Yeah.
Well, this is the classic thing. You could say, oh well, you get out of there as fast as you can. But in some places, the recommendation for him it might be because he's powerless. So it's to do the right thing for as long as you feel like you can do the right thing and still be employed, which sometimes is a danger if you don't do what's required in those contexts. And some I would advise to then stay and try to be a light in that situation, to represent a different way of doing business. And so in his case, though, as one of the least powerful in that new unit, he's looking around and he's going to do his job and do it to the best of his capability for a period of time, but then he's going to go back and get a job in, I think, a master's in finance. And so he was also calling me for a reference for that. So, so I mean, each situation is different. Sometimes it's an encouragement to stay and to try to represent good and ethical job performance. And then sometimes you're kind of overwhelmed by the odds against you, and it's time to look for a different space, a different company. I met a guy that I'd known as an acquaintance in college, and we'd been in this Campus Crusade group together and shared some of those positive experiences. But when I met him in the workplace, he was demoralized. He really was. He was just demoralized, felt like this wasn't a worthwhile thing to be there. And one piece of advice that could have been given to him, this is not what I gave him, but is, you need to leave that since it's difficult, since it's challenging, since how you're impacting people is not quite clear, and you need to, go into the ministry. Because that was something that he kind of thought, like, I've kind of missed it. I missed the boat. The real spiritual people are in the ministry, and I didn't do that, so I missed the boat. And it was a really wonderful thing to be able to talk to him about, like, this may very well be the place you're supposed to be, because we need people here.
This is your ministry.
Yeah, this is your ministry. And that there's these folks that you're surrounded by, and the questions they're asking about what's right or good in terms of ethics, or even what's important or not important in terms of life, they're not often going to decide, well, maybe I'll go to church and see what they think about it. So most of these folks are never going to grace the inside of a church, and yet you're kind of the hands and feet of Christ there, the light there, that I couldn't get to if I was in full-time vocational work, Christian work. And so it was a wonderful time to kind of encourage him and spur him on that this was where he was supposed to be, that set of engineers that he interacted with and sometimes irritated him and often challenged him with different kind of norms was his ministry. And really kind of turned him around, and was a great lesson to me too, that that's the place he was supposed to be. And so when we sit in this room and we say that can never happen to me, then we ought to just check ourselves and realize that in the right dynamics or the wrong context, maybe temptations that any of us could be in our companies could be susceptible to these things. So that we need to prepare for it. That's part of our leadership roles, to prepare for that and try to minimize the opportunities for those things to happen. Because even good people can be tempted to do very bad things, and often we see that. And I do refer sometimes when I'm talking to leaders in particular about an article that was in Journal of Business Ethics, somewhere we just published our research, we hope, and it was called the Bathsheba Syndrome. And for those who've read in the Old Testament, you might this might put a light bulb in your head, about David, who was called a king, who was called man after God's own heart. So you'd call this guy one of the good guys, right? Who then fell into, in this case, sexual sin because of a couple things that happen when leaders, and he was a leader, he was a king. He grew in the opportunities, his understanding of what he could do, right? He had more power. He became more isolated. Fewer people were asking him questions about what he was doing and how he was spending his time. He had achieved a great many things, and his ego and his pride had started to allow him to think, maybe I deserve a little bit for all the things I've done for the kingdom, right? And then pride, again, not reaching out, maybe when he had a temptation, feeling like he could handle this himself. And so if I'm connecting that, or if you're making this connection, what I'm trying to do here is say that leaders, and many of you are these types of leaders in terms of people who've been so very successful and have done the good thing and have a great track record, but at that same time, then you have maybe more opportunities and fewer people who are challenging you. And so we need to be careful to make sure that we have that friend, that time growing spiritually that helps us strengthen us to resist those temptations that we might encounter. But those scenarios, just for application for you folks, what that means, instead of a case like this organization I don't work at, it's these conversations you have with people that you're probably know and are going to see tomorrow. So we start out with some conversations about what happens when your roommate does this. Says, hey, I've got the test from last semester, do you want it? Or a roommate says, I know you're struggling, you've got a lot, this is a real terrible week, do you want some of my Adderall to kind of give you a boost? And so these are people you know, not some shady person on the side of the street that says, hey, do you want some drugs, or do you want some, And so we're teaching them in that context, like, how do you say no, but say it in a way that preserves the relationship? So it's kind of a simple, we call it the no sandwich. You probably use this in different ways with feedback, but you say...
No sandwich?
The no sandwich. So thank you for trying to help me on that, but no, I don't want the Adderall, or I don't want the answers. But hey, if we could study together tonight, that would be real helpful. So you sandwich a no with two positive statements that affirm the relationship. Because just like this story I mentioned about a supervisor, sometimes the person who's inviting you to be unethical thinks they're doing it for your best benefit. Like, you'll be able to get your bonus if you do this. But you've got to say no to them, but you've got to see them tomorrow. Or you got to go to lunch with them later this afternoon. And so you have to have the skill to be able to say no and maintain your morals, but also maintain the relationship and be savvy about it.
But I'd like to say we should give Mitch a huge round of applause for joining us. Thank you.